My name is Vivian Cross. I am 34 years old. I am a licensed estate attorney at Mercer and Associates in Denver, Colorado. I have spent the last 9 years of my professional life doing one thing with precision and care, making sure that when someone dies, what they wanted to happen actually happens. I have sat across from elderly clients who were terrified their children would fight over everything they had spent a lifetime building. I have drafted documents and witnessed signatures and notarized pages, and filed with probate courts, and done every single procedural thing the law requires to make sure a person's final wishes are protected. I know this process better than most people know anything, which is why, when I sat in an attorney's conference room on a Thursday afternoon and listened to a will being read that I had never seen before, I understood within the first 4 sentences exactly what had happened. And I did not say a single word. I sat completely still. I listened to every word. I waited until the reading was finished and every person in that room had collected their things and walked out. Then I stood up. I thanked the attorney for his time. I walked to my car in the parking lot. I sat for exactly 2 minutes. Then I called my investigator and said 4 words: "Find the original document." Before I tell you what he found and what happened in the 3 weeks that followed, tell me where you are watching from right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. My grandfather, Thomas Edwin Cross, built things with his hands his entire life. He grew up in a small town outside of Pueblo, Colorado, the third of 5 children in a family that had very little money and a great deal of pride in the difference between those two things. He left school at 16 to work construction and spent the next decade learning every trade that would hire him: framing, roofing, electrical, plumbing, finish, carpentry. By the time he was 26, he had enough knowledge and enough saved to start his own small contracting company. By the time he was 40, he had built it into something real. Not a corporation, not a dynasty, just a solid, honest business that employed 11 people and had a reputation in Pueblo County for doing the work right the first time. He met my grandmother, Ruth, at a church social in 1971. She was a school teacher who read constantly and laughed easily and had no patience for pretense of any kind. They married within a year and spent the next 4 decades doing what people who are genuinely compatible do. They built a life that looked like the sum of 2 people's best qualities rather than a compromise between their worst ones. My grandmother died of a stroke when I was 11 years old. I remember sitting in the back of the car on the way home from her funeral watching my grandfather's profile in the front seat, and understanding for the first time that some absences are so large they change the shape of everything around them. He never remarried. He said once that he had gotten lucky the first time, and he was not going to push it. He sold the contracting business 3 years after my grandmother died, because running it without her felt like wearing a coat that no longer fit. He kept the house, a 4-bedroom craftsman in a quiet neighborhood that he and his crew had renovated themselves 30 years earlier. He kept his workshop in the garage, where he spent most mornings building furniture he gave away to people who needed it. He kept his garden. He kept his routine. And he kept his relationship with me in a way that he did not keep with anyone else in the family, not because he loved anyone less, but because I was the one who showed up. I want to be honest about that because it matters to what came later. I showed up, not because I wanted anything, because I genuinely liked him. Because sitting in his workshop on a Saturday morning while he explained the difference between oak and walnut and why the grain mattered was the most comfortable I ever felt anywhere. Because he talked to me like I was capable of understanding serious things, which in my family was rarer than it should have been. I drove from Denver to Pueblo every 3 to 4 weeks for 9 years. I called every Sunday evening. I remembered his doctor appointments and helped him research the medication changes his cardiologist recommended and sat with him at the hospital the 2 times his heart gave him trouble in his early 80s. I was not performing devotion. I was simply present in the way that some relationships call for without requiring you to explain why. My mother, Sandra, lived 40 minutes from my grandfather and visited perhaps 6 times a year. This is not a criticism. It is a fact I am stating plainly because it is relevant to what happened. She had her own life, her own schedule, her own version of their relationship that was real even if it was not frequent. My grandfather loved her. He also knew her. He knew the way she moved through the world, the charm she deployed when she wanted something, and the particular quality of attention she paid to anything that might eventually benefit her. He had raised her. He understood her in the way parents understand children they love clearly. He told me once in the last year of his life that he had made arrangements and that I should not worry. He said it in the specific way he said things he wanted to land without making a speech about them. I heard it. I filed it. I assumed it meant what it appeared to mean. He died on a February morning, 2 days after his 83rd birthday. His neighbor found him in the workshop. He had apparently gone out early to work on a small cabinet he had been making for a friend's grandchild and had simply stopped. The paramedics said it was almost certainly his heart and that it had been quick. I drove to Pueblo that day in a state that I now recognize as the particular autopilot that grief uses to keep you functional when functionality is required. I handled what needed handling. I coordinated with the funeral home. I called the relatives. I found his files. In his files, I found a copy of his will, dated 11 months before his death, leaving his estate in its entirety to me with a specific note attached in his handwriting that said, "This is what I want, and I want you to know I thought about it carefully." I held that piece of paper for a long time. Then I put it in my bag, and I continued handling what needed handling because that was what the moment required. The estate attorney he had used was a man named Gerald Hoffman, a Pueblo practitioner who had been doing small estate work for decades. I called his office the week after the funeral to initiate probate. His assistant told me that Mr. Hoffman was aware of the estate and that a reading had already been scheduled. She gave me the date. I thanked her and wrote it on my calendar and did not think anything of the scheduling until I walked into that conference room on a Thursday afternoon and saw my mother sitting at the table with an expression that I had seen before and had learned over 34 years to pay careful attention to. It was the expression she wore when she already knew how something was going to end. Gerald Hoffman was professional and thorough. He introduced himself to everyone present, which was myself, my mother, my Uncle Raymond, who was my grandfather's younger brother, and a neighbor of my grandfather's named Harold, who had apparently been named as a witness. Mr. Hoffman explained the process. He opened the folder in front of him. He began to read. The will he read was dated 14 months before my grandfather's death, 3 months before the one I had found in his files. It left the house, the workshop contents, the investment accounts, and the remainder of the estate to my mother, Sandra Cross, with a small bequest to my Uncle Raymond and a note of affection for me that contained no assets whatsoever. I sat completely still. I am a trained attorney. I have read hundreds of wills. I know what a valid document looks like, and I know what questions its existence raises when another document exists that post-dates it by 3 months. I did not ask those questions in that room. I did not look at my mother. I did not change my expression. I listened to every word with the same professional attention I bring to any document I am reviewing for the first time. When Gerald Hoffman finished, he asked if there were any immediate questions. I said no, thank you, I will follow up in writing. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said she was sorry that Daddy had made his own decisions, that she hoped this would not come between us. Her hand on mine was warm and steady. Mine was the same. I thanked Gerald Hoffman again. I collected my bag. I walked to the parking lot. I sat in my car for 2 minutes. Then I called Daniel Reyes. Daniel Reyes has worked as a private investigator in Colorado for 18 years. I have used him on 4 cases over the past 6 years when I needed someone to locate documents, verify signatures, or trace asset transfers that clients suspected had been tampered with. He is precise, discreet, and does not ask questions beyond what the task requires. When I called him from that parking lot, I gave him the basic information in the order it was relevant. My grandfather had died. A will had been read that predated a document I had found in my grandfather's files by 3 months. I needed the original filed document located, authenticated, and compared. I needed the chain of custody for both documents established. I needed to know who had prepared the earlier document when it had been signed and who had witnessed it. Daniel said he would start that afternoon. He asked if I wanted to know what he found as he found it or in a complete report. I said, as you find it. Then I drove back to Denver and went to my office and worked until 9 in the evening, because working was what I knew how to do when everything else felt like standing at the edge of something I was not yet ready to look at directly. The first call from Daniel came 48 hours later. He had located the filing records at the Pueblo County Probate Court. The earlier will, the one read by Gerald Hoffman, had been filed 6 weeks before my grandfather's death. The filing had been initiated not by Gerald Hoffman, but by a different attorney, a younger practitioner named Stephen Carlisle, whose office was in a strip mall near the highway outside Pueblo. Daniel had pulled the filing documents. The witnesses listed on the earlier will were 2 individuals he had not yet identified. My grandfather's signature on the document had been notarized by a notary public, whose stamp matched a name he was running down. The second call came 3 days after the first. Daniel had spoken with Gerald Hoffman's assistant, who confirmed that Gerald Hoffman had prepared the later will, the one I had found in my grandfather's files, dated 11 months before his death. She confirmed that my grandfather had come in alone, had reviewed the document carefully, had signed it in Gerald Hoffman's presence, and had taken a copy with him. She confirmed that Gerald Hoffman had retained the original in his client files and had been preparing to file it with the probate court when he received notice that a different will had already been filed. He had been attempting to verify the situation when I called his office. This was the moment I understood the full shape of what had happened. Someone had filed an earlier will after my grandfather's death to preempt the filing of the legitimate one. Someone had used a different attorney to do it. Someone had arranged witnesses and a notary and a signature that would hold up to initial scrutiny. And that someone had been sitting across a conference table from me, squeezing my hand and saying she was sorry. I did not call my mother. I want to be precise about that because it is the part people find hardest to understand. I had enough information at that point to know what had been done. I did not have enough to prove it in court, and I am an attorney. I know the difference between knowing something and being able to demonstrate it with documentation that will survive a legal challenge. I called my own attorney instead. Her name is Margaret Osai, and she practices civil litigation in Denver with a specialty in estate disputes. I had referred clients to her 3 times over the course of my career. I had never needed her myself. I laid out everything I had in the order it occurred. The will I had found in my grandfather's files, the earlier will filed by Stephen Carlisle, Gerald Hoffman's records, Daniel's preliminary findings. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Vivian, I want you to understand what we are looking at." I said, "I understand what we are looking at." She said, "I know you do. I want to say it out loud anyway. This is probate fraud. It is also potentially forgery, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud if more than one person was involved in the preparation and filing. These are not civil matters only. They are criminal matters." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, "Completely." She said, "Give me 48 hours. 3 days later, Margaret filed a formal challenge to the probate of the earlier will in Pueblo County District Court. The challenge cited the existence of a later valid document prepared by Gerald Hoffman, whose records and testimony would support its authenticity. It cited irregularities in the preparation and filing of the earlier document, including the use of a different attorney, the timing of the filing relative to my grandfather's death, and questions about the witnesses and notarization. It requested a full forensic examination of both documents. It notified the court that a referral to the district attorney's office was being considered pending the outcome of that examination. My mother called me 4 hours after the filing. She had been notified by Stephen Carlisle's office, who had presumably been notified by the court. Her voice on the phone was a version of her voice I had heard before, but not often. The version that appears when charm has run out of places to go. She said, "Vivian, what is this?" I said, "It is a legal challenge to the probate of a document that does not represent my grandfather's final wishes." She said, "You are making a terrible mistake." I said, "Mom, I do this for a living." She said, "Your grandfather made his decision, and you need to respect it." I said, "I found his decision in his filing cabinet 3 days after he died. It was dated 11 months before his death and prepared by Gerald Hoffman, who has the original on file." I said, "Whatever you did in the last weeks of his life, the record is going to show it." She started to say something else. I said, "I am not going to discuss this further. You will hear from Margaret Osai's office." Then I ended the call. My hands were steady. My voice had not changed. I am 34 years old, and I have been an estate attorney for 9 years, and I have watched grief do things to families that I would not have believed if I had not seen them professionally documented in court records. I was not shocked. I was not devastated in the way I might have expected. I was something quieter than both of those things. I was the version of myself that shows up when a case requires clarity rather than feeling. And I had apparently decided somewhere between that parking lot and Daniel's first phone call that this was a case now. The forensic examination took 3 weeks. The court appointed an independent document examiner who analyzed both wills for paper composition, ink chemistry, printing characteristics, and signature authenticity. Gerald Hoffman provided his full client file, including the original signed document, the notes from his meeting with my grandfather, and the records of my grandfather's prior visits to his office over the preceding decade. Daniel located both witnesses listed on the earlier will. One was a former colleague of my mother's from a job she had held 12 years earlier. The other was a man who had done occasional yard work for my mother, and who, when contacted by Daniel, expressed significant distress about having signed something he had been told was a routine document. The notary whose stamp appeared on the earlier will was located in a different county. Her stamp had been used without her knowledge on at least 2 occasions in the preceding year, a fact that had already generated a separate inquiry she had not connected to anything until Daniel's contact prompted her to look more carefully at her records. The forensic report was delivered to the court on a Wednesday. I read it that evening in my office. The conclusions were stated in the precise, measured language that forensic experts use in legal proceedings, and that I have been reading for 9 years. The signature on the earlier will was not consistent with authentic signatures produced by Thomas Edwin Cross in documents spanning 4 decades of his life. The paper and ink of the earlier will were inconsistent with documents produced by Stephen Carlisle's office during the period when they were purportedly prepared. The notarization stamp was determined to be fraudulent. The document was, in the examiner's professional opinion, fabricated. Margaret filed the forensic report with the court the following morning. She simultaneously delivered a copy to the Pueblo County District Attorney's office with a formal referral for criminal investigation. 2 days later, Stephen Carlisle's office closed. The sign came down on a Friday. By the following Monday, his bar license had been suspended pending investigation. My mother was contacted by investigators from the district attorney's office on a Tuesday. She retained a criminal defense attorney by Wednesday. My uncle Raymond called me that week. His voice was careful and sad in the way that voices get when someone has been holding something difficult for longer than they can manage. He said, "Vivian, I need to tell you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I knew something was wrong when I walked into that room. I knew Tom's signature. I have known it for 60 years. He said I did not say anything because I was not sure and because Sandra is my niece and I did not know what to do. I said I understand. He said I should have said something. I said, "Raymond, you are saying something now." He gave a statement to the investigators the following week that corroborated the forensic findings from a different angle. The angle of a man who had watched his brother sign documents for 6 decades and knew that what had been presented in that conference room was not his hand. The probate court invalidated the earlier will 8 weeks after the forensic report was filed. The later will, prepared by Gerald Hoffman, was admitted to probate as the authentic expression of my grandfather's final wishes. My grandfather's estate, which included the house, the workshop, the investment accounts, and the remainder of his assets, passed to me as he had intended. My mother was charged by the Pueblo County District Attorney's Office with probate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Stephen Carlisle faced disbarment proceedings in addition to criminal charges related to his role in preparing and filing the fraudulent document. The yard work witness cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity. My mother's former colleague retained her own attorney and maintained that she had not understood what she was signing, a claim the investigators assessed with appropriate skepticism. I did not attend any of the criminal proceedings. I followed them through Margaret's updates and through the court dockets I accessed directly because I know how to read them. My mother pleaded guilty to a reduced charge 14 months after the initial filing. She received a suspended sentence, 5 years of supervised probation, and was ordered to pay restitution for the legal costs generated by the fraudulent filing. She did not go to prison. I have examined my feelings about that outcome carefully and honestly, and I have concluded that what I feel is not satisfaction and not disappointment, but something more like the particular exhaustion that comes after a long case closes. You put it down. You find that your hands are empty in a way that takes some getting used to. My grandfather's house is still standing in Pueblo. I have not sold it. I have not decided yet what to do with it because it is the kind of decision that deserves more time and more clarity than I have been able to give it while everything else was still moving. I drove there on a Sunday in November, about 6 months after the probate court issued its final order. I let myself in with the key that had been on my keyring since the last year of his life when he had asked me to have one in case he needed me. I walked through the rooms. The furniture he had built was still in place. His tools were still in the workshop in the order he kept them. There was a small cabinet on the workbench that he had not quite finished, the one he had been working on the morning he died. A cabinet for a friend's grandchild. I stood in that workshop for a long time. I thought about a man who spent his last morning making something for a child he was not related to because it was what he did with the hours he had. I thought about what it means to know someone that well and to be known by them and to carry that forward after they are gone. I thought about the document in his filing cabinet that said this is what I want and I want you to know I thought about it carefully. He had thought about it carefully. He had done everything right. All I had done was make sure what he did right actually counted. That is what estate attorneys do. We make sure the careful thought of one person survives the chaos that follows their absence. I have been doing it for 9 years for other people's families. I did not expect to have to do it for my own, but I was prepared. And preparation, in the end, is the only revenge that does not cost you the thing you were trying to protect. My grandfather built things that lasted. I made sure what he left behind lasted too. If you have a loved one whose final wishes you want to protect, make sure those documents are filed correctly, with an attorney who retains the originals, and that someone you trust knows where they are. Do not leave it to chance. Do not assume goodwill will hold when money enters the room. My grandfather trusted the right person. He just did not account for someone who trusted herself to get away with rewriting his decision after he was gone. She did not account for what I do for a living. What would you have done in that conference room? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, you already know what to do.